It didn't actually mention area, and the Minister, in my view, answered that. Question number 5, Dr. Kennedy Graham.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Climate Change Issues, International Negotiations, and asks, does he stand by his statement that, quote, it is completely incoherent for the world to be now tentatively coordinating actions to put a price on carbon on the one hand, while simultaneously massively subsidising consumption of carbon?
The Honourable Dr. Nick Smith.
On behalf of the Minister, yes.
Dr. Kennedy Graham.
Supplementary. Well, how does he reconcile that statement with the work of his colleague, the Minister of Energy, who stated last year, quote, we've taken a number of actions as a government to support the oil and gas sector, including $25 million worth of free geotechnical information and 183-day tax exemptions.
The Honourable Dr. Nick Smith.
Mr. Speaker, the world spends about $500 billion US per year on subsidies. There are countries that spend more money on subsidising fossil fuels than they spend on education. The programs that this government has funded include GNS being funded to do seismic surveys and petroleum information on New Zealand's huge exclusive economic zone and extended continental shelf. Those amounts are quite minuscule, and I think it's a long stretch to call those subsidies. It is simply New Zealand wanting to know what resources it has in that huge ocean area for which it is responsible.
Dr. Kennedy Graham.
How is the granting of millions of dollars of taxpayer-funded research and tax breaks to private fossil fuel companies not a subsidy on fossil fuels?
The Honourable Dr. Nick Smith.
Mr. Speaker, it is about the government spending its money to find out what is in the ocean area for which New Zealand has responsibility, an area 20 times our land area. And this government makes no apologies for funding both GNS and other parties so that New Zealand can make informed decisions based on what resources there is in that huge area of ocean.
Dr. Kennedy Graham.
Is he perhaps then concerned that the government's emissions trading scheme, which grants large unconditional subsidies to trade-exposed sectors with 80 years of phase-out and allocates free units to polluters, could be determined to be, quote, arbitrary or unjustifiable discrimination by the World Trade Organization? And if not, why not?
The Honourable Dr. Nick Smith.
It's a very long stretch for the member to claim that a partial exposure to the emissions trading scheme, for instance, like our aluminium smelter or our steel mills, who are some of the very few in the world to pay any price for their emissions, to pay effectively a partial price. And there is a huge difference between those businesses paying a partial price and those countries that deliberately set out to spend hundreds of billions of dollars subsidising fossil fuels. And it is absolutely consistent for this government internationally to advocate that those large fossil fuel subsidies be reduced if the world is serious about reducing greenhouse gas emissions.
Dr. Kennedy Graham.
If we're in the business of comparing size for size, then how does he reconcile the government's further delays to the ETS, which, according to the ETS review report, will result in New Zealand taxpayers and households further subsidising greenhouse gas emitting industries by at least hundreds of millions of dollars?
Mr. Speaker,
the Honourable Dr. Nick Smith.
Mr. Speaker, this member and others make this gross error of trying to claim that somehow not exposing industries or consumers to the full price of carbon over all their emissions is somehow a subsidy. A subsidy implies that there is a cost to taxpayers. That is not true. It is not true, and members opposite who attempt to run that argument are ignoring the fact that there is no international agreement beyond the end of 2012 for reducing emissions at this point, and without it there is no cost to the New Zealand taxpayer.
Dr. Kennedy Graham.
Taking the Minister's definition of a subsidy as a cost to the taxpayer, then what is his response to the Parliamentary Commission for the Environment's report on lignite, which states, quote, As things currently stand, companies that develop products from lignite on a large scale are likely to receive subsidies of millions of dollars per year from the taxpayer.
The Honourable Dr.
Mr.
Nick
Speaker,
Smith.
the question as to whether the development of lignite resources for the briquettes, for urea or diesel, and whether they would be eligible for an allocation under the emissions trading scheme is an open question. And the reason that I'm hesitant to give a judgment on whether they would or they would not is because there is a proper legal process when an application is being made, and I would be subjecting myself to judicial review if I expressed a view on that prior to the proper legislative criteria that's set down in the Act prior to even receiving an application.
Dr. Kennedy Graham.
Is it then this government's hesitant policy that the rest of the world should produce and use less fossil fuels, but New Zealand should produce and use more? And if not, why is his government granting subsidies to greenhouse polluters?
The Honourable Dr. Nick Smith.
No, it is not, and this government is not providing subsidies to greenhouse polluters. I remind the member, we are the only country outside of the EU to have an emissions trading scheme. Our aluminium smelter in Bluff is the only aluminium smelter in the world to face any price at all for its greenhouse gas emissions. This government is about New Zealand doing its fair share on climate change, and that is exactly what we are doing.
Question number 6, David Shearer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.